everyone. Welcome to another episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Last year on At the Boundary, I spoke with Dr. Caitlin Lee, Director of the Acquisition and Technology Policy Program in the RAND Corporation's National Security Research Division. At the time, we focused on Chinese drones on the heels of the Countering CCP Drones Act, as well as the Defense Department's Replicator Initiative. We invited Caitlin back to talk a bit about those mysterious drones over New Jersey, as well as lessons learned from drone usage in Ukraine. Quick reminder first, registration is ongoing for GNSI Tampa Summit 5. Scheduled for March 4th through 5th here at USF, the Russia-Ukraine War, Lessons for Future Conflicts, will look at the technical innovations and strategy evolutions arising from the largest land war in Europe since World War II. This will include a panel focused on drone usage in Ukraine featuring, unsurprisingly, Caitlin Lee. So today we'll get a hint at the insights she'll be dropping. Go to our website for details, and we'll drop a link in the show notes. I also want to briefly tell you about a new research article written by GNSI research fellow Dr. Guido Rossi. His examination of the military recruiting crisis was published on Real Clear Defense, and it offered disturbing trends to the crisis, what's behind it, and what he recommends as solutions to the problems. We'll drop a link to the article in the show notes. We'll also have an upcoming episode of At the Boundary with Dr. Rossi to discuss his analysis. For today's conversation, we're excited to welcome Caitlin Lee back to the program. She got her PhD in War Studies from King's College London and teaches as an adjunct professor at Georgetown in addition to her work at RAND. She brings a 20-year healthy fascination with drones and autonomous warfare to the program. Caitlin, great to have you back.
Great to be here, Jim. I don't know that the fascination is healthy, but it's certainly there.
But it certainly exists. No doubt about that. Well, it's healthy for what we're talking about today. No doubt about that. So let's start with New Jersey, my home state where I was born and raised. Listeners likely recall the wave of news stories in November, December about these enigmatic drones over New Jersey. And, the discussion, it went from the plausible, insightful to just the wildly conspiratorial. The New Jersey Mystery Drones Facebook page already has 85,000 followers on it, and it does make for some very entertaining reading. Now, I don't have your expertise, but my view is that while not necessarily nefarious, the activity is notable, and the lack of insight from the government is a bit disconcerting. What's your take?
Yeah, I think it is disconcerting that the government hasn't really weighed in publicly, given the public outcry about these drone sightings. And by the way, the New Jersey series of drone sightings was only the latest one. You may recall last year there was this period of about, I think, up to 17 days where there were just very consistently drones flying over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, where we keep our fifth generation F-22 fighter jets.
Yes.
Langley actually ended up having to move the jets around just because they were just so exposed to whatever this apparent drone surveillance operations that were ongoing. So we have that incident, and there were also some incidents in the UK where there was drones kind of consistently flying over for U.S. military air bases in that region as well. And so this is an ongoing problem, and so there'll be this temporary sort of news blitz, and then it sort of goes away. And I think that really came to a head, the other day when someone asked President Trump, like, hey, what's going on with that? And he told his chief of staff, go find out.
Go do something about that.
Maybe we'll finally get some more, information about it. I mean, there was actually a poll recently done about, what are these, what does the average person actually think these drone sightings are about? And like almost half said they thought it was more than just like recreational drone use. Like the first thing that kind of came out from the government was, hey, this is just hobby drones, or it could just be aircraft and they're being misidentified. But then the government kind of walked back that position and said, we don't really know what we're dealing with. And there's been some concern in Congress that this could be foreign surveillance. And I think that's a real possibility.
Yeah. I read too, the drone sightings, there was in Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, California, Florida, Minnesota, Langley Air Force Base, as you said, in Virginia. I mean, are these related? Are they separate? Or do we just simply don't know?
Well, I mean, I think we don't. I mean, certainly the American public doesn't know, and it's unclear if the government knows. And I think, um, after the spy balloon incident last year, when China flew their spy balloon, literally like starting up near Canada, flew it from the west coast all the way to the east coast of the United States before we finally got an F-22 up there to shoot it down. Talk about overkill.
Yeah.
And a day late and a dollar short.
I was sort of thinking the same thing. And they fired a a very expensive missile to do it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was our solution. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in how the U.S. government thinks about like missile defense in general and drone defense as well. I mean, these are real threats. I think that these drone sightings really highlight that. It's for years and years and years, it's always been, these lights flying near military bases, they're just aircraft flying or they're test aircraft. And there was this big sort of controversy, were these UFOs, things of that nature. We never really got that resolved, but now we very clearly do see these drones. I mean, sometimes, yes, are people misidentifying like civilian aircraft or commercial aircraft? Sure. But there are like legit drone sightings. And
yeah, the days of calling this swamp gas are over. You can't get away with that explanation anymore. Because I mean, there's too many sightings. There's too much, visual evidence of these drones in large numbers in these different locations.
Yeah, and it's super hard to identify. Like when they are drones, like it's super hard to identify them, especially if they're flying relatively low and they're small, because FAA radar, air traffic control is just not designed to track that. So that's not something that's going to come up on their radar. These drones aren't going to be necessarily squawking friend or foe. One thing that's been kind of interesting to me is the drones often do light up, which you would think if it was some kind of surveillance operation, they would not want to be seen. But the flip side of that is, maybe that's a bit of a poke in the eye. So I wouldn't rule it out.
Hey, we're here and you can't do nothing about it. That sort of thing.
Exactly. And we can't do anything about it. I mean, it's especially when they're low altitude, you don't have any like systematic way to track them. Even if you do, maybe you're actively looking for that electronic signal between the drone and the controller. Maybe if you are looking for that, you can get somewhere, but then you still have to as soon as that person stops flying the drone, you don't know, you still can't connect the drone to a human being. So you still haven't sort of run down, you haven't done the forensics on where the drone's coming from. So it's a hard problem. It's layered by this problem of the interagency where state and local governments have a say over this. And then also the federal government, the FAA. So there's layers upon layers of bureaucracy that deal with this airspace where the drones are flying, which greatly complicates everything. So it's like this awful brew of sclerotic bureaucracy combined with this very kind of novel use of this technology that's cheaper and more available to a wider set of people than ever before. And so we're seeing it operating in new and different ways that we need to get a handle on, and our government's been pretty slow in doing that.
So let's conjecture for a second. So Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, has been tasked to go find something out and tell the American people. If she called you and said, "Hey, Caitlin, I heard I heard you on this podcast. You seem to know something about drones. You seem to have thought about this. How would you advise her? Even sources or maybe even possible lines of inquiry would they potentially pursue?"
Yeah, I think the first thing is to clarify the rules around disabling these drones when they're flying near military bases. That would be my first course of action. I understand that the airspace is complex, and there's a real concern, legitimate concern about both about accidentally shooting down a commercial aircraft, of course, or some kind of small private plane. But then there's also the fact that even if you used an electronic warfare to disable the drone, that it's going to land somewhere. It could be in someone's backyard. So these are real problems. At the same time, I think there's probably a way to split the baby or square that circle by having some rules about when drones are in certain proximity to military bases, you can take them down, and having some technology ready to do that. I think that's the other problem. There were reports when the drones were flying over UK air bases that the US actually did try to get the drones out of the sky, and whatever technology they were working, whether it was a kinetic shot at the drone or some kind of electronic warfare, it didn't work. So there's also this huge problem. I think the first thing is figuring out the regulations to make it possible to take down the drone are near military bases. And the second thing is to get to make it a real priority to develop counter drone technology to defend the homeland. I think there is the Army is the executive agent for counter UAS, and there is actually we talked about the Replicator initiative last time. Well, the Replicator, the first tranche of Replicator was this Department of Defense initiative to the plan was to field thousands of small, capable drones that look like the ones in Ukraine. Well, the second tranche of Replicator equipment is supposed to be counter drone technology, because there is this recognition that there's a threat. I just think we're probably not moving out quick enough on that. And my main concern is that these drones can surveil and do surveil critical infrastructure, potentially even in the United States. But secondarily, if you can imagine U.S. ground forces in combat somewhere, they're going to come up against these drones too. And we need to have counter drone technology readily available on our tanks and our other armored vehicles. I mean, you saw at the inauguration that the Trump administration's vehicles actually had some counter drone technology on them, but that needs to become much more commonplace for ground forces. And we also need to have a layered approach. Maybe there's electronic warfare. Maybe there's also some, kinetic effectors that we can use in a layered approach to protect our military bases. And it can't just be, traditionally the Army does air defense, but it can't just be an Army problem. Like the Air Force needs to step up. And, if Langley Air Force Base is getting surveilled by foreign intelligence, the United States Air Force needs to step up and do something about that.
Yeah. But now in the United States, I mean, don't they come into issues of, what when I was in the military, we call posse comitatus, which is, using of U.S. forces to operate on the U.S. homeland. So, and employing some of these capabilities, employing, electronic warfare type of techniques that could impact the local area. It maybe impact local civilians. And I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, it's a very delicate balance to be able to do that and not, impact civilian infrastructure or the civilians living near these locations.
It totally is. And we do have, these laws, posse comitatus, as you mentioned, that's to prevent Title X military action in the continental United States. But you know what? Hey, we have test ranges, huge test ranges that are hundreds and hundreds of miles in this country. We have them in Florida, in your home state, and we have them in Alaska. And so I do think there's ways to sort of adjust the airspace to accommodate a defensive measures to respond to the threat. You got to do that around. You just have to do that around U.S. military bases. Well,
it's a different, I mean, it's kind of, if nothing else, the appearance of these drones, whether they're nefarious or not, and hopefully we'll learn more in the future. It does illustrate that. And like you said, all of a sudden they're conglomerating around Langley Air Force Base, which is a very sensitive location. And it's almost like, well, we don't know what to do about it except move the airplanes inside a shelter. I mean, there should be more. It's almost like it's a new threat that we haven't quite figured out how to defend against. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So moving on a little bit, I think, we talked about this last time too. And I think when most people think of drones, they think a lot of either the big military drones or the more smaller commercial drones. And we spoke briefly yesterday in prep for this conversation today, and you talked about how the use cases of drones are expanding. And even kind of blurring into other military capabilities. And you talked a little bit about, artillery and missiles and how drones are used for some of these traditional types of activities. Can you expand on that a little bit for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, it does go straight to the sort of the story of drones that we've seen emerge in Ukraine, where, you take your typical sort of little quadcopter drone, hobby drone that you can buy on Amazon. And, at the beginning of the war, especially, the Ukrainians were pretty ingenious and just, strapping a mortar onto the bottom of that drone and dropping it on top of a tank. And you've seen the Ukrainians very rapidly innovate and try to kind of essentially substitute drones for their lack of fires and their lack of personnel. And so that has been a major forcing function for them to engage in drone innovation, because drones, they've discovered, can be relatively cheap and lethal. And so
what's the old saying? Necessity breeds innovation. I mean, that's kind of where that's where they were at there. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think No, I think so. I think that's exactly right. And so there's been this rapid adaptation of drone technology to confront this threat, and not just the technology, but also the tactics and the operations. So the Ukrainians have used the drones in some creative ways. The Russians have responded, as well, and have started to kind of produce their own drones. Also, of course, import drones from Iran, like the Shahed. And so every time Ukraine does innovate, Russia does respond. But Ukraine has been able to stay ahead of this, I think, in part because they've been very well funded till now by the United States and Western countries to develop their own indigenous drone production. They've been very aggressive about that. I think they produced over 1 million drones last year. And so they've been successful, and they've been somewhat successful in this concept of substituting drones for their sort of dwindling manpower and their lack of fires overall. But drones are they're not a poor substitute, but they're also not a great substitute. Ukraine has, of course, barely been able to hold ground. The summer offensive last year was sort of disappointing, and every day is a real struggle. That said, Ukraine has innovated at the tactical level in some important ways with drones. For example, one thing they've done that's sort of remarkable is they've been able to attach mines to drones, and so anti-personnel mines. And so those drones can go behind Russian front lines, and they can essentially just drop mines along the supply lines to squadron or platoon positions, and effectively cut off those positions. And so that's been an ingenious way that the Ukrainians have, for example, used drones to go after Russian forces. Other things they've done, they're using a lot of first-person view drones, where you can, like, if you're flying it looks like you're stationary using a controller, but it's like you're flying inside the drone. You can see what the drone sees. And they've been using those in sort of drone on drone combat to shoot down Russian reconnaissance drones that will come into the Ukrainian front line. So they'll come maybe 40 miles even into the Ukrainian front line, these Orlan 10 drones the Russians fly. And Ukraine will sometimes be able to knock them out of the sky, either using air defense, electronic warfare, but also sometimes drones. So that's another creative use. So there's been a lot of tactical innovation with drones, and on both sides. And that's kind of, drones have certainly helped to keep Ukraine in the fight, although certainly haven't been revolutionary in terms of, they don't offer the war-winning advantage that Ukraine needs.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. A lot of people have covered this, but it's still interesting when all the things you talk about, it's not necessarily in the tech. It's not a technological advancement necessarily. It's more in, we call the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and just the innovative ways to use what's still a fairly rudimentary technology in terms of a small commercial drone, but just thinking on ways to exploit them in methods that just ingenious sometimes.
Yeah, they've definitely been able to do that. And I think the other piece is that they don't have, these drones are by and large, I think, still flown by individuals. Mm-hmm. But there's been a lot of reporting and fanfare about, both Russia and Ukraine operating autonomous drones, or drones that are essentially thinking machines that can orient themselves in their environment and then make decisions independently of human control. I don't know how much there really are autonomous drones operating in Ukraine. But I think that is coming. There's certainly companies that advertise they are selling fully autonomous drones to Ukraine. There's a company in Germany that's saying they have these fully autonomous drones that can not only fly to their target, but then actually use computer vision to identify targets and prosecute them. So is that coming? I mean, is there a there behind the hype? We'll see. And Ukraine itself has reported that they have used drones with some limited autonomy. So there was one report that some of these long-range drones that Ukraine is using to strike into Russia, that they do have, I wouldn't call it autonomy or artificial intelligence, but they're able to pre-program the flight paths of the drones. And so that eliminates the need for a data link, which is a good thing, because then the Russians can't attack the data link with their electronic warfare systems. Yeah. So that's good. That's not AI, but that's helpful. And then the other thing, though, that Ukrainians say is that some of these long-range drones have computer vision, which is AI, where basically you keep a catalog of targets on the edge in the drone, and the drone can match up those targets in its database with the targets on the ground. So that is some rudimentary sort of starting to look like artificial intelligence. I do think it's coming. I just don't think we're seeing fully autonomous AI-enabled drones in Ukraine yet, although I think Ukraine and Russia have very good incentives for trying to get there.
Well, yeah, they do. And well, in the current conflict, obviously, but I think the rest of the world is probably watching and going, well, we probably need to develop this as well. I do think there's and you touched on this, there's a little bit of a lack of understanding of the difference between an uncrewed aerial vehicle and an autonomous vehicle. And we talked about that at the conference we had. We had another conference where we talked about AI in the Air Strategic Competition, and we spent a good portion of that conference just defining what AI is. And there's, you ask 10 different people and get 10 different answers. So I think some of this has to do with sometimes they say, oh, it's fully autonomous, it's using AI. And you look and you go, well, yeah, maybe, sort of, but not exactly. But I would agree that we're on the pathway to that. And I think not just, obviously it's in Ukraine's and Russia's immediate best interest to develop that, but then other nation states as well are going to, they're going to have to confront that as well. And I would imagine, again, and that's why we're going to do this conference in March to look at these lessons learned and say, okay, how is this going to impact future conflict? Not just in Europe, but in any place, and maybe the U.S. and maybe not involving the U.S. What are some things we need to do to prepare for that future conflict, which is going to look very different based on the things we've seen in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it could look very different. I think for the U.S., the most serious challenge really is kind of bolstering U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific theater to deter China. And that's a vast theater. I think we talked about this last time.
We did,
really demands a different kind of different kinds of forces with different capabilities. Mm-hmm. But I do think there are some lessons learned. For example, just to be a little more, put a fine point on it, why would Ukraine or Russia want to have more autonomous drones? I think there's a few reasons. We alluded to one earlier, which is simply that if a drone truly is autonomous, if it truly does not need to communicate with a human to make decisions in real time and prosecute targets, then it doesn't need to have a data link. And those data links that's a good thing because data links are very vulnerable to jamming. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason why any nation might want to pursue fully autonomous weapons. Another reason is that autonomy really speeds up the pace of battle. So if you get a first mover advantage, if you have autonomous weapons and the other side doesn't, so you can move very fast and go on the offensive. It's kind of a scary thing because it could mean that it just is basically easier to start a war or easier to break a stalemated conflict. Like we saw that in, I think, a little bit in Armenia, when Armenia and Azerbaijan were fighting in 2020. It's like drones kind of enabled Azerbaijan to break a long, decades long simmering stalemate and get a decisive advantage. There are problems with the Armenian air defenses too, but drones definitely helped. So just being able to move much faster because the machine thinks faster than a human is another reason to pursue autonomy. And then I think a third reason is that autonomy really enables mass. If you have to have a guy associated with every single platform, that's just not very efficient. And Ukraine certainly doesn't really have the manpower to do that at scale. No one really does. And so if you can actually build truly autonomous systems that can orient themselves and do their own mission planning and targeting, then you can have one operator, one human that's providing some oversight over, tens, maybe even hundreds, maybe even thousands of drones that are all operating independently, but aware of each other in the environment and kind of optimizing to hit different targets. So those are some of the reasons why nations might pursue autonomous weapons. They can provide some really important advantages, both at the operational level, but potentially even at the strategic level. Yeah,
you talked a little bit when we spoke yesterday about disaggregated capabilities, spreading those out, over a drone swarm.
Yeah, Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about what an F-35 is, it's this flying weapons platform that's also it fully integrated sensor suite. It can do some command and control. It can do air to air, do air to ground. It's very much a multi-mission airframe, and it costs about 85 million a copy. The United States can buy those, but for some of our allies and partners, that's pretty expensive. And what if you can buy, hundreds of fully autonomous drones? Each one has some little piece of F-35 capability. So there's one drone that has a great radar on it. There's another drone with some weapons, and a third drone that's just a decoy. And so you start to disaggregate those capabilities. And if those drones are operating in a swarm, the sum becomes greater than its parts, because now you've got sort of all that capability built in, but you're presenting this real dilemma for the adversary, because the targeting has gotten so much more complicated. They're not shooting at one F-35, they're shooting at 100 drones that together make up that capability. So it can provide a real advantage in that way as well.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the F-35 came up, and I knew some, I haven't studied it closely, but I know some people flew it. The thing about the F-35 is that it's able to collect and, I guess, sort of share information. I mean, it's such an incredible sensor platform, and it can basically, if you have a formation of F-35s, everybody knows what every single jet knows. They all have the same shared picture of the battle space. And now you do that with, 100 drones around a single F-35. That is the concept of that is quite formidable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's different functions and sizes and varieties that these drones can come in. I mean, they're really just airplanes that can be all different sizes. And in fact, there's also drones that are just one-way attack drones that are really just missiles. So they're an incredibly flexible platform. And so what's really interesting about them is because you don't have a human in them, you can make them very small. You can use different kinds of materials. One thing I'd like to see the U.S. take more advantage of, and I haven't seen it yet, is you can do less testing, OT&E, like operational test and evaluation. We should not be testing our drones to death. We should be moving them out quickly because there's no human, and we don't have to worry about the safety of the pilot.
It's okay to fail.
It's okay to fail.
Especially if it's one of 100 drones. If one or two fail, and even in a combat operation, yeah, that's okay.
Yep. And there's a certain price point where that becomes infeasible, but we need to do the hard work of figuring out what that price point is. And the other thing about it is if it's a one-way drone, your maintenance cost just went away. And that's a huge deal because as you well know, a huge part, really the most crushing part of our defense budget is operations and maintenance for aging weapon systems. And so if it's a one-way drone and I don't have to bring it back to the depot, that's a big advantage.
Yeah, the supply chains that go with maintenance for the aging weapon systems especially are huge. It just eats up the budget. So we're going to talk about Ukraine in March a bit, and maybe you'll touch on this. But I guess as we start to maybe move on to a slight different topic, as a thinking or researcher in this area, can you talk about any from the lessons learned of drone usage and drone evolution in Ukraine? Can you pull out any key nuggets, key big themes or big lessons that kind of just sort of strike you as, man, these are kind of the big mega themes that seem to be not evolving, but emanating from that conflict?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think one of them is that there is a need to focus very sharply on lower altitude airspace. Historically, the Air Force has focused on very high altitudes above 30,000 feet or so, and sort of winning air superiority to create the conditions for prevailing on the ground or at sea. And that is still a very important function for the Air Force and one the Air Force needs to focus on. However, there is this need to think about at least defending at lower altitudes. And I think that's like I said earlier, that's largely an Army problem in terms of if you're talking about land warfare, but it's an Air Force problem too if you're talking about an air base that's vulnerable to these low flying threats that aren't going to come up on traditional radar that might look like birds on a radar. And so this is actually an Air Force problem. There are some people that go to the extreme and say the Air Force needs to sort of stop focusing on air superiority and go to like totally double down on air defense and lower altitude air defense and buying lots of small drones. I am not in that camp. I still think that the Air Force number one mission is air superiority, and it's an expeditionary force. It's never going to need or should it never should be buying hundreds of small tactical drones that have very limited flight time. That is not an Air Force mission. But I do think this what we've seen in Ukraine does demonstrate that you need air defense at every altitude. And you need to really defend your critical infrastructure. So I think that's absolutely a lesson learned. I think another lesson learned is that electronic warfare cannot be sort of the redheaded stepchild of weapon systems anymore. It's really important. I think part of the reason that it is often the redheaded stepchild is that it's often very classified. You know, if you even think back to World War II, like number one thing you don't want is you don't want your adversary to be able to decode your communications, right? You want to have good cryptography. You want to have good signals intelligence. And so, you know, remember all those Bayraktar TB2s we had at the beginning of the war? Well, that inventory was quickly attrited in large part because of Russian electronic warfare systems. So that countermeasure fight in the EW space is one to really watch. I think absolutely that would play out in any great power conflict between the US and a peer, whether it's China or, you know, Russia, for example. So that would be a second one. I think a third one is really that the pace of conflict is really going to be picking up and changing. And you've seen this countermeasures fight playing out very quickly, and you've seen both sides very rapidly adapt. I think that that's a trend that will continue to play out going forward. And then finally, and this is less about Ukraine than just the world, the kind of the geopolitical environment overall, I think we have entered a very dangerous period in modern history, post-World War II history. We have serious challenges in almost every theater. And a major challenge for this next administration is going to be to ruthlessly prioritize these challenges, because we don't have the bandwidth in terms of people, in terms of weapon systems, in terms of intellectual bandwidth to effectively deal with all these challenges at once. And so thinking about how to handle Ukraine and acute crises in the Middle East, specifically with Iran, handling those quickly to really turn our attention to China, which has a 1 million man army, which has way more missiles and ships than we do, which has clearly indicated its intentions to be an aggressor in its own theater. I think we need to figure out how to prioritize that. And so while we should be watching Ukraine, I think the lesson of Ukraine is actually to like step back and look at how all these conflicts affect the United States and how they're interconnected.
Yeah, I agree completely with you. It just doesn't, the challenge of doing that, of that type of prioritization. I mean, the U.S. national strategy tried to do that, to pivot to China. And, I'm here in Tampa, and Central Command is right across town. And unofficially, friends that we either work in around Central Command, they kind of joke, said, yeah, we pivoted to China, but apparently the Middle East didn't get the memo. And, and things were just, like you said, things were just kind of exploded really over the last few years in the Middle East, and just incredible dynamic change. Some for the good, Bashar al-Assad falling. That could be for the good. Although it always remains to see what the unintended consequences are. But it's still just an incredibly dynamic place, and you can't ignore China. You can't completely ignore Russia's continued hegemonic ambitions and what they're doing in Ukraine. the entire last week's podcast, we talked about, I talked to two gentlemen that run a podcast. It's called Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? And it was a really interesting podcast because there's a lot going on and people, it's just China, which is, yes, that's the pacing threat. But there's a lot going on outside of that and related on the edges. It's not making the news, but it's still relevant and needs to be paid attention to. But you can't, like you said, you can't do everything.
No, you can't. And I think there is a need to my personal view is there is a need to do a hard pivot to the Indo-Pacific. I think, and in fact, I think Central Command, that area of responsibility, is a place where actually some like good air defense and drone defense technology could be really important. Iran and other nations have really figured out that, and the Houthis, right? I mean, have really figured out that drones are very effective, cheap weapon systems, especially against our, multi-million-dollar SM-6 missiles. And so, it's not a great day when you have to use one of those to shoot down a Houthi drone. So I think there's a really big need for some air defense in that theater. And then like shoring up some of that, but then and always keeping, of course, the special operator mission in both the Middle East and Africa, keeping special forces there, but pivoting more generally to the Indo-Pacific, I think is a really important thing. And like you said, the average American isn't paying attention day to day, but if there were a conflict there and they no longer had access to their latest cell phone technology because the TSMC on Taiwan got blown up or disabled or taken over by China, they would definitely notice that. Yeah,
they'd care then. Care a lot then. And the lessons learned from Ukraine, and you touched on that, but I like to kind of pull on that string a little bit more. The application of the lesson, it varies, I guess, region to region. So Iran is going to learn a different lesson than China, is going to learn a different lesson than Taiwan, is going to learn a different lesson than the United States, and how the United States approaches its drone usage and drone defense as well will be different based on the threats it faces, based on the neighborhood it lives in, based on its national strategy. What are those implications for or I guess how specifically do you see the United States needing to take these lessons learned from that conflict and apply them to where they see themselves, where we see ourselves going in the future?
Yeah. So I think the biggest lesson learned from like a U.S. military perspective is that we need to be thinking about how we can equip our allies and partners with the same kinds of drone technologies that Ukraine is using. So my sincere hope is that Taiwan, which has been pretty enamored with buying larger, more exquisite weapon systems for several decades, things like F-16 fighter jets, my hope is that they'll look at Ukraine and say, if I really want to sort of stave off a conflict or give, Beijing a really bad few days or a month before the U.S. Decides what it's going to do, I need to be buying lots of small, many cheap, easy to use things that I can manufacture indigenously and quickly. Like that is the lesson I most hope gets taken from this conflict, is that Taiwan sees that and starts to actually build up its porcupine strategy in earnest to complicate things for China.
It's interesting how you spoke earlier that going to an all drone force is just not going to work for the U.S. Air Force. Obviously, you still need the high end systems. You still need to defend the high altitude airspace. You still need to maintain air superiority. But that's, I guess you could say, that's been Taiwan's approach to a certain extent with the weapon system they've been buying. But now you're saying, but it's like you have to do a little bit of both, and understanding there's limited resources, but still you have to do a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think for Taiwan, which is just so much more limited, as most countries are compared to the United States, I think they do have to make a choice. And I think the choice really should be to look at that lower cost suite of weapon systems that they can deploy quickly, that they can demonstratively show to demonstrate their deterrence capability. I think that's really important for them. And I do think for U.S. forces, and specifically the U.S. Air Force, the future is, frankly, it's unmanned. It's just that it's going to take longer, I think, for the U.S. Air Force to get there because of the kinds of unmanned technologies they're going to need. I'm not convinced that we know exactly what that looks like yet. I mean, the Air Force has their Collaborative Combat Aircraft program, which is a program to mate up unmanned systems with manned systems like the F-35. That's a start. But I think there's still a lot of discussions that need to happen for the Air Force in terms of, do these drones need to be operated in highly contested airspace? If so, are they attritable? Do they need to have survivability characteristics? Like, these are the kinds of questions that we still need to answer. That's all going to take a while. And so it's going to be a slower integration process for the Air Force in particular. But I think for some of the other services, it could be much quicker. And certainly for the Air Force, I hope to see them move out quickly, because I think unmanned systems can be real force multipliers, and they can be lower cost than some of the more exquisite systems the Air Force is buying today.
Wow. Okay. So I'll tell you what, that was, we have zinged across the world from New Jersey to Ukraine to Taiwan, and talking about drones. I mean, it's really been a fantastic conversation, and we'll see you in March, and we'll be able to hear more about this, and really looking forward to the panel you're going to be on as we do wind up the podcast. Any final thoughts you may have on all the stuff we talked about, or any clippings on the ground that you want to insert back into the final film there to get on audio?
Yeah, I think the main thing is just watch the news closely. Like, when you see articles about autonomous or AI-enabled systems in Ukraine, go and read the news article and see if there's any actual evidence that these drones are doing anything other than flying under like the remote control of a human. There is some evidence that that's starting to happen. I think it's going to move quickly, and I think you will see more autonomy in AI-enabled systems. But read the article carefully and figure out, is this really an innovation, or is this something we've been seeing for a while? And continue to track that story. I think we're going to see some change in 2025. And
by the article, you don't mean the Drones Over New Jersey Facebook site. You're talking about like the news article, correct?
Yeah. You can use all the social media resources at your disposal to put together a picture. Thinker. Like I tell my kids, exactly, be a critical thinker. Like I tell my kids, you need multiple sources of information.
Yep, and a lot of it's out there. You got to sift through it and try to determine the chaff from the wheat. Be a critical thinker, but it is out there, and I think like you said, there's subtle and not so subtle, evolutions happening in drone warfare, and we're seeing it in Ukraine, and then the impacts that'll have on how we do things in the States, and how we help our partners, and how our partners approach us as well. Even if full autonomy is advertised but isn't really happening, it's out there. I mean, and that's where we're trying to head to, and it's going to change the nature of warfare significantly.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot more to come.
Well, Caitlin, thank you so much. Like I said, I really look forward to seeing you in March. Look forward to having you back here. It'll be nice and warm in Tampa when you come down here in March. It's a good time of year to be down here. So looking forward to having you at the conference.
Looking forward to it as well. Thank you, Jim.
I want to thank our guest, Dr. Caitlin Lee, Director of Acquisition and Technology Policy Programs for the RAND Corporation's National Security Research Division. Next week on At the Boundary, we'll drop in on a thought-provoking conversation between former U.S. Ambassador to Panama, Barbara Stevenson, and GNSI Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. The two of them had a fireside chat co-sponsored by GNSI and USF World, looking ahead to the national security challenges and opportunities the new Trump administration will encounter. As you might expect, this conversation with the former ambassador to Panama includes interesting thoughts on the Panama Canal. You don't want to miss that. Thanks for listening today. If you like the podcast, please share with your colleagues and network. You can follow GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well at usf.edu/GNSI, where you can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, fascinating, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.